They called them the Ghost Battalion. Not because they vanished, not because they haunted the barracks at night, but because they were already gone, long before they stepped off the train in rural Kansas. They arrived in the dead of winter, 1944, wrapped in uniforms that hung like shrouds on skeletal frames. Their eyes were sunken, their hands trembled, and their silence was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were the last remnants of the German Sixth Army, the men who had survived the encirclement at Stalingrad, the death marches east, the Soviet labor camps, and the slow starvation that followed. And when the United States took custody of them in a prisoner exchange, they brought with them something no one could see, but everyone could feel: the weight of having lived when better men died. Camp Concordia, Kansas, population 5,000, was not prepared for them. Built on flat, windswept prairie land, the camp was designed to hold 4,000 POWs. By 1944, it held over 4,500, mostly from North Africa and Western Europe. The men played soccer, grew vegetables, published a newspaper called Der Zaungast, the fence guest. They were, by all accounts, model prisoners. Then, the Stalingrad survivors arrived, and everything changed. Within days, a strange phenomenon began to spread through Compound C, where the new arrivals were housed. Men would wake at exactly 2 a.m., dress in full uniform, boots polished, cap straight, and stand in formation in the frozen yard. They would remain there for hours, motionless, staring east toward a homeland most of them knew no longer existed. When guards asked what they were doing, they never answered. They simply returned to their bunks at dawn and slept through the day. American officers called it combat fatigue. Camp psychiatrists labeled it mass hysteria. But the other prisoners, the Italians, the North Africans, even the regular Wehrmacht, knew better. They called it die Geisterkompanie, the Ghost Battalion. And they were afraid of it. This is not a story about ghosts in the supernatural sense. There were no floating specters, no rattling chains, no cold spots in the barracks. The horror was far more intimate, far more human. It was the sight of men so shattered by guilt and memory that they no longer belonged to the world of the living. They were here, but they were still there, in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the snowdrifts of the Don River, in the cattle cars heading east. And in their silence, they carried a question that would haunt everyone who encountered them. Why me? To understand the Ghost Battalion, we must first understand Stalingrad. Between August 1942 and February 1943, nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped in the industrial hellscape of Stalingrad by a Soviet counteroffensive. Cut off from supplies, freezing in sub-zero temperatures, eating rats and boiled leather, they fought street by street, room by room, corpse by corpse. When the Sixth Army finally surrendered on February 2, 1943, only 91,000 men were left alive. Of those, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest died in Soviet captivity, of typhus, starvation, exhaustion, or despair. But survival was not mercy. It was a sentence, because to survive Stalingrad was to carry the memory of every man who didn't. The friend who shared his last piece of bread, the comrade who pushed you into cover and took the bullet, the lieutenant who walked into no man's land to retrieve a wounded boy and never came back. And for those who made it out, through prisoner exchanges, diplomatic deals, or sheer luck, The guilt was unbearable. By 1944, the US and Soviet Union had agreed to limited exchanges of wounded or non-recoverable prisoners. Among the first to be transferred were 117 men from the 6th Army, emaciated, frostbitten, and mute. They were shipped by rail across Siberia, through Iran, and finally to New York Harbor, where they were handed over to American custody. From there, they were sent to Camp Concordia, not as soldiers, but as ghosts.
Camp Concordia was an unlikely place for such a haunting. Located in Cloud County, Kansas, it was a model of American efficiency and order. The camp had a hospital, a library, a chapel, and even a small theater. POWs were paid in scrip for labor, picking cotton, building roads, harvesting wheat, and could spend it at the camp canteen on cigarettes, chocolate, and Coca-Cola. Red Cross inspectors called it the most humane POW camp in the Western Hemisphere. For most prisoners, it was a reprieve. But for the Stalingrad men, it was a kind of torture. Because kindness, when you've spent years believing you don't deserve to live, doesn't feel like mercy. It feels like mockery. Take the case of Corporal Dieter Meyer, one of the first to arrive. Before Stalingrad, he'd been a schoolteacher in Hamburg. After, he weighed 89 pounds and hadn't spoken in 14 months. When given a clean uniform at Concordia, he refused to wear it. He slept in his tattered field gray, even in summer. When offered a hot meal, he ate only bread and water. When a guard asked why, Meyer finally spoke, his first words in over a year. "The others didn't get to eat. Why should I?" He wasn't being dramatic. He was being honest. This was the core of the Ghost Battalion's trauma. Survivors' guilt so profound, it became a form of self-punishment. They refused to bathe, not out of defiance, but because cleanliness felt like betrayal. They avoided the canteen, not out of principle, but because pleasure felt like theft. They wouldn't write home, not out of shame, but because they believed their families were better off thinking them dead. And every night at 2 a.m. they formed up. Not to escape, not to protest, but to remember. Camp records show that the 2 a.m. formations began on January 12, 1944, the one-year anniversary of the final Soviet assault on the 6th Army's last position. The men would stand in the snow, sometimes for 5 hours, facing east, as if waiting for orders that would never come. When Captain Robert L. Hayes, the camp's intelligence officer, questioned them, they gave no explanation. But one man, a former medic named Carl Weber, finally whispered, "We are keeping watch. In Stalingrad, if you slept, you died. So we take turns, even now." Hayes didn't understand, but he stopped trying to stop them. Because by then, even the American guards had begun to feel it. The eerie stillness that fell over Compound C at night, the way the wind seemed to hush when the Ghost Battalion marched in place, the sense that these men were not prisoners of war, but prisoners of memory. The psychological toll was immense. U.S. Army psychiatrists assigned to the camp noted a disturbing pattern. The Stalingrad men exhibited symptoms not of depression, but of what we would now call moral injury, a deep wound to the conscience caused by perpetrating, failing to prevent, or witnessing acts that violate one's moral code. But here's the twist. Most of these men hadn't committed atrocities. Many had been conscripts, clerks, medics. Yet they still felt guilty. Why? Because they survived. And in the moral economy of total war, survival often feels like complicity. A declassified psychological evaluation from March 1944 describes Private Eric Brown, a former radio operator. Subject states he hears the voices of his platoon every night. Not screaming, not accusing, just calling his name. He says they are not angry, they are confused. Why him and not us? He has no answer, so he stands watch. It is the only penance he knows. Another report notes that when the camp showed the film Casablanca, 14 of the Stalingrad men walked out within 10 minutes. One later explained, "The characters choose love over duty. In Stalingrad, there was no choice, only duty. And it killed us all." This was the true horror of Camp Concordia. Not the fences, not the watchtowers, but the unbearable clarity that came with peace. In war, you don't have time to think. You act, you survive, you bury the dead and move on. But in the quiet of a Kansas winter, with 3 meals a day and a bed to sleep in, there was nothing to distract them from the past. And the past, for these men, was a graveyard they carried in their chests.
The American response was a mix of compassion and confusion. Camp Commandant Colonel James Whitmore, a former history professor from Yale, ordered that the men be given space. No forced labor, no mandatory activities. If they wanted to stand in the snow at 2 a.m., let them. They're not hurting anyone, he told his staff, and maybe, in their way, they're healing. But healing was not what they wanted. What they wanted was absolution, and that no American camp could provide. Instead, they created their own rituals. They began singing. Not songs of victory or nationalism, but old Bavarian folk tunes, lullabies, hymns, ballads about home and mountains and peace. They sang them every night at 3 a.m., after the watch ended, in perfect 4-part harmony. Guards on perimeter duty reported hearing the music carry from miles across the prairie. When asked about it, one prisoner said, "We are singing them home, the ones who never made it. If we stop, they will be lost forever." The singing became sacred. No one spoke during it. No one moved. And if a new arrival tried to join, he was gently but firmly turned away. "You weren't there," they would say. "You don't know the words." This exclusivity deepened the mystery. Other POWs began to avoid Compound C altogether. Even the camp's German-speaking chaplain, a Lutheran minister named Ernst Vogel, admitted he felt unsettled when he visited. He wrote in his journal, "They don't look at you. They look through you, as if you're already dead." By spring 1944, the Ghost Battalion had become a legend, not just in Camp Concordia, but across the U.S. POW system. Rumors spread that the men were cursed, that they'd made a pact with the dead, that they were waiting for Hitler to rise again. The truth was far simpler and far more devastating. They were waiting for forgiveness, and they knew it would never come. In the spring of 1944, the U.S. Army sent a civilian psychologist to Camp Concordia, not to treat the prisoners, but to study them. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a 38-year-old professor from the University of Chicago and one of the few women working with the Office of the Provost Marshal General on enemy morale and post-combat behavior. She had spent the previous year analyzing Italian POWs in California, documenting how homesickness, propaganda, and camp conditions affected cooperation and mental health. But nothing in her training had prepared her for Compound C. When she first observed the Ghost Battalion during their 2 a.m. formation,
She didn't see madness. She saw ritual. "They're not hallucinating," she wrote in her field journal. "They're commemorating. And in that commemoration, they've created a world where the dead are still present, and the living are merely caretakers." Dr. Marsh requested special access. She learned German as a child. Her mother was from Frankfurt. She spoke it with a soft, almost nostalgic accent that disarmed even the most withdrawn prisoners. Over the next 6 weeks, she conducted 47 private interviews. Not in an interview room, but in the camp library, over cups of weak American coffee that the men accepted only out of politeness. What she discovered was not a single trauma, but a layered architecture of guilt, memory, and silent oath. The men of the Ghost Battalion, she learned, had made a pact, not with each other, but with the dead. It began in the final days of Stalingrad. As the Sixth Army collapsed, food ran out, ammunition vanished. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, entire limbs. Men ate glue from boot soles, drank radiator fluid, buried comrades in shallow graves that froze solid by morning. In that hellscape, a quiet understanding formed among the survivors, that if any of them lived, they would carry the names of the fallen, not just in memory, but in action. "We promised," one former sergeant told Dr. Marsh, his voice barely above a whisper, "that if we made it out, we would never forget. Not their faces, not their voices, not the way they died. And we would never enjoy anything they didn't get to have." That was the core of their silence. It wasn't depression. It wasn't shell shock. It was a vow of mourning, a self-imposed exile from the world of the living until they too could join the dead. Dr. Marsh documented this in a classified report titled "Psychological Continuance Among Stalingrad Survivors: The Phenomenon of Posthumous Loyalty." In it, she wrote, "These men do not see themselves as survivors. They see themselves as vessels. Their bodies live, but their identities belong to those who perished. To laugh, to eat well, to sleep soundly, to do any of these would be to betray the pact. Their suffering is not passive, it is active penance, and in their eyes it is the only honorable path left." The Army buried the report, not because it was false, but because it was too true, too morally complicated for a nation that wanted to believe its POW camps were simple stories of humane treatment and enemy rehabilitation. But Dr. Marsh kept her notes, and in them she recorded something even more unsettling. The Ghost Battalion wasn't just remembering the dead. They were waiting for them. The turning point came on the night of April 17, 1944. It was unseasonably warm for Kansas, 58 degrees, with a full moon casting silver light over the prairie. At 2 a.m., as usual, the 117 men of the Ghost Battalion formed up in the yard. But this time, something was different. They didn't face east. They faced the camp hospital. And they stood not in military formation, but in a loose semicircle, as if surrounding something. Guards radioed the duty officer. Captain Hayes arrived within minutes, flashlight in hand. He approached cautiously, expecting illness, escape attempt, or protest. Instead, he found them watching. Inside the hospital window, Private Erich Braun, the radio operator who heard his platoon calling his name, lay dying. Braun had collapsed 3 days earlier during work detail. Pneumonia, the doctor said. But Dr. Marsh suspected something deeper, what she later called soul exhaustion. His body had simply given up on carrying the weight. Now, as he slipped in and out of consciousness, the Ghost Battalion stood vigil. Not for him, for the men he would soon join.
At 3:14 a.m., Brown died. And in that moment, the Ghost Battalion did something they had never done before. They broke formation. One by one, they walked to the hospital door, removed their caps, and placed them on the steps. Then they returned to the yard, stood in silence for exactly 17 minutes, the number of men in Brown's original radio platoon, and began to sing. Not a folk song, not a hymn, but the Deutschlandlied, the German national anthem. Not the Nazi version, the old one, the one about unity, justice, and freedom. American guards froze. Playing national anthems was forbidden. This could be seen as defiance, as propaganda, as a threat. Captain Hayes raised his hand. Let them sing. And they did. For 12 minutes, their voices rose over the prairie, clear, strong, mournful. When they finished, they returned to their barracks without a word. The next morning, Dr. Marsh interviewed the man who had led the singing, a former school teacher named Hans Richter. "Why the anthem?" she asked. Richter looked at her, eyes red, but steady. "Because Erich is home now, and the anthem is how we welcome the dead back to Germany, even if Germany no longer exists." He paused. "We do not sing for the living. We sing for the ones who finally got to stop carrying the weight." That night, for the first time since their arrival, the Ghost Battalion did not form up at 2 a.m. They slept. And when they woke, something had shifted. Not all of them, but enough. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Marsh noticed subtle changes. Some men began to accept extra rations. One started tending the camp garden. Another asked for paper and ink to write a letter, though he never sent it. But the most significant shift was in their silence. They began to speak, not about the war, not about Stalingrad, but about small things, the taste of American bread, the sound of Kansas wind, the way the stars looked different here than in Bavaria. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall. Dr. Marsh believed Brown's death had released them, not from guilt, but from the belief that they had to suffer forever to honor the dead. Brown had gone first, and in doing so, he had given them permission to live a little. But then came the letters. In May 1944, the Red Cross facilitated a special mail delivery for the Stalingrad men. Letters from home that had been held in neutral Switzerland for over a year. For most, it was the first word they had had from their families since 1942. The effect was catastrophic. Of the 117 men, 89 received letters, and of those, 72 stopped speaking again within 48 hours. Dr. Marsh read some of the letters, with permission. They were not angry, not accusatory, just ordinary. "The roof is leaking. Lysol started school. We miss you. Come home soon." But to men who believed their families thought them dead or worse, disgraced, the normalcy was unbearable. One man, a former baker named Otto Keller, received a letter from his wife describing how she had replanted their orchard. "She's moving on," he told Dr. Marsh, tears streaming down his face. "But I'm still in the snow. How can I go back to a world that's already healed without me?" Another, a young corporal named Felix Weber, got a photo of his newborn son. He stared at it for hours. Then he tore it into tiny pieces and flushed them down the latrine. I don't deserve to be a father. I left 200 boys in Stalingrad. What right do I have to raise one of my own? The letters didn't bring hope. They brought reckoning. Because hope requires a future. And these men had long ago surrendered theirs to the past.
By summer 1944, the Ghost Battalion had fractured. Some clung harder to the silence. Others began to participate in camp life, cautiously, guiltily, as if testing whether they were allowed to exist. But one ritual remained unchanged: the singing. Every night at 3 a.m., they gathered in the yard and sang. The repertoire grew: old folk songs, church hymns, even fragments of opera. Dr. Marsh recorded several sessions on a wire recorder, a rare device at the time, and in her notes she described the sound as both beautiful and devastating. A choir of men who sing not to be heard, but to keep the dead from fading. Then, on August 3, 1944, the singing stopped. No warning, no explanation. One night it was there, the next, silence. Dr. Marsh investigated. She found the men sitting in their barracks, fully dressed, staring at the walls. When she asked what happened, one finally spoke. "We ran out of songs." At first, she didn't understand, but then she realized they had sung every song they knew. The ones their mothers sang, the ones they learned in school, the ones they hummed on the march to Stalingrad. And when the last note faded, they had nothing left to offer the dead. The silence that followed was deeper than any before. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. And in that emptiness, something new began to grow. Not hope, but despair. The final phase of the Ghost Battalion story is the hardest to tell, because it is not about resilience, not about recovery, but about the quiet unraveling of men who had nothing left to hold on to. In September 1944, the first suicide occurred. Private Carl Newman, a former medic, was found hanging in the latrine. He left no note, but in his bunk, Dr. Marsh found a list, 147 names, neatly written in pencil. At the bottom, he had added his own. He wasn't the first to die, one of his barracks mates told her, but he's the first to choose it. The others were taken. He went willingly. 2 more followed in October, then 4 in November. The camp tightened security, removed belts, shoelaces, anything that could be used, but the men found other ways: starvation, exposure, sheer will. Dr. Marsh pleaded with Washington to transfer them to a psychiatric facility. Her request was denied. "They are enemy combatants," came the reply, "not patients." But she refused to give up. In December 1944, she proposed an experiment. She asked the men if they would be willing to write their memories, not for the army, not for history, but for each other. A collective diary, where each man could record the name of someone he lost and how they died. To her surprise, they agreed. For 3 months, they wrote, not in German, but in a kind of hybrid: simple sentences, broken grammar, raw emotion. Dr. Marsh collected the pages each week and bound them in a cloth-covered ledger she called the Book of Names. In it, you'll find entries like this. Ludwig Hoffmann, 22 years old, gave me his last bread on January 12, 1933, said, "You have a wife, I don't." He died that night. I ate the bread. I still taste it. Sergeant Major Ernst Vogel carried 3 wounded men to safety on January 28, 1944, collapsed in the snow, told us, "Go, I'll catch up." He never did.
we should have stayed. My brother, Thomas, 19 years old, shared a foxhole with me, took a bullet meant for me. I never told Mother. I couldn't. The act of writing did not heal them, but it gave them a new ritual. Instead of standing in the snow, they wrote. Instead of singing, they remembered in ink. And for a time, the suicides stopped. Dr. Marsh believed she had found a way to help them carry the weight without breaking. She was wrong, because the war wasn't over, and home was not waiting. In April 1945, Germany surrendered. The news reached Camp Concordia on May 8, VE Day. The camp erupted in celebration. Italian POWs danced in the yard, North Africans sang, even regular German prisoners allowed themselves a rare smile. But in Compound C, there was only silence. The Ghost Battalion gathered at dusk, not to mourn, not to celebrate, but to decide. Dr. Marsh watched from a distance as they stood in a circle, heads bowed. After an hour, they dispersed. The next morning, 94 of them requested repatriation, not because they wanted to go home, but because they believed they had no right to stay. "We are not Americans," one told Dr. Marsh. "We are not even Germans anymore. We are Stalingrad. And Stalingrad has no place in this world." The U.S. government processed their requests quickly. By July 1945, most had been shipped back to Europe. Dr. Marsh never saw them again. But she kept the Book of Names. And in her final report, she wrote, "They were not broken by war. They were broken by survival. And in their brokenness, they showed us the true cost of total war, not in cities destroyed or economies ruined, but in the souls of men who lived when they believed they should have died. Let us not call them cowards for their silence. Let us call them witnesses, and let us never forget what they carried so we wouldn't have to."
When the last transport ship carrying the Ghost Battalion left New York Harbor in August 1945, Dr. Eleanor Marsh stood on the dock in the rain, clutching a cloth-bound ledger to her chest. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She simply watched until the ship vanished into the gray Atlantic mist. In her pocket, she carried a single letter from Hans Richter, the schoolteacher who had led the singing of the anthem the night Erich Braun died. It read, "Thank you for letting us be human one last time. Do not mourn us. We were already gone. But if you remember our names, then we are not entirely lost." She would keep that letter and the Book of Names for the rest of her life. But the story of the Ghost Battalion did not end with their departure. In many ways, it had only just begun. Because returning to Germany was not a homecoming. It was a second exile. The men of the Sixth Army arrived in a nation that no longer recognized itself. Cities in ruins, families scattered, futures erased. The Germany they had fought for, the Germany of Goethe, Beethoven, and orderly train schedules, was gone, replaced by rubble, hunger, and silence. And in that silence, their own trauma found no echo. No one wanted to hear about Stalingrad. Not the Allies, who saw them as perpetrators, not the Soviets, who viewed them as fascists, and not their own countrymen, who were too busy surviving to dwell on the past. So the Ghost Battalion did what they had always done. They went quiet. But this time, there was no 2 a.m. formation, no midnight singing, no shared ledger of names. They were alone with their ghosts, and for many, that was unbearable. Of the 117 men who arrived at Camp Concordia in January 1944, only 89 were repatriated in 1945.
The rest had died, by illness, by suicide, by the slow erosion of will that Dr. Marsh called soul attrition. Of those 89, fewer than 30 would live to see the year 1960. Their fates followed a grim pattern. Some vanished into alcoholism, drinking until their bodies gave out. Others took menial jobs, janitors, night watchmen, grave diggers, as if punishing themselves for having survived. A few joined neo-Nazi cells, not out of ideology but out of a desperate need to reclaim the certainty of war. But most simply folded into the background, becoming the quiet uncles who flinched at fireworks, the fathers who never spoke of the war, the old men who stared out windows for hours, seeing not the street, but the Volga River in winter. One of the most haunting accounts comes from Dieter Meyer, the former schoolteacher who refused to wear his clean uniform. He returned to Hamburg in 1946 to find his wife remarried, his home reduced to rubble, and his students grown into strangers. He took a job cleaning classrooms at a new school built on the ruins of his old one. Every day, he swept the floors where he once taught Goethe. Every night, he walked to the Elbe River and stood on the bank for hours, facing east. He never spoke of Stalingrad. But in 1953, a student found a notebook in the trash behind the school. Inside were 147 names, neatly written, one per page. At the bottom of the last page, Meyer had written, "I am still here. Forgive me." He died of pneumonia in 1957. The cause, according to his doctor, was chronic exposure to cold. He had been sleeping on a park bench for weeks, refusing shelter. Another, Otto Keller, the baker who tore up his son's photo, returned to Munich and opened a small bakery. He baked bread every day, but never ate it. Customers said he worked in silence, his eyes distant, his hands moving like they were kneading snow instead of dough. In 1951, he closed the shop without warning. His neighbors found him weeks later in his apartment, surrounded by loaves of moldy bread, starved to death. On the table was a single slice, untouched, with a child's drawing pinned to it, the son he never met. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the final chapter of the Ghost Battalion story. Men who survived the war, survived captivity, survived kindness, only to be undone by peace. Because peace for them was not relief. It was reckoning. And in that reckoning, they found no absolution, only the unbearable weight of having lived when better men died.
But while the men disappeared, their story did not. The Book of Names remained with Dr. Marsh, who became one of the first American psychologists to advocate for the recognition of what she called survivor's burden, a concept that would later evolve into the clinical term moral injury. In lectures at Harvard, Yale, and the Veterans Administration, she argued that the deepest wounds of war were not physical, but moral. The guilt of surviving, the shame of complicity, the silence of witnessing. Her work was largely ignored during her lifetime. The 1950s and 60s were dominated by narratives of victory and resilience. There was no room for stories of men broken not by enemy fire, but by their own conscience. But she kept the ledger. And in 1972, she donated it, along with her field journals, interview transcripts, and the wire recordings of the midnight singing, to the Kansas State Historical Society, with one condition: it remains sealed for 25 years. She died in 1989, never knowing if anyone would read it. In 1997, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, archivist Margaret Chen unlocked the box. What she found stunned her. Not just the ledger, but hundreds of pages of notes, detailed, compassionate, and profoundly human. And the wire recordings, miraculously preserved, their reels brittle but playable. When she played the first tape, a fragment of the Deutschlandlied sung on that April night in 1944, the entire archive staff fell silent. There was no triumph in those voices, no nationalism, only grief so deep it felt sacred. Chen spent the next 3 years researching the men. She tracked down surviving relatives, cross-referenced names with German repatriation records, and even visited Stalingrad, now Volgograd. What she uncovered became the basis of her 2001 book, The Ghosts of Concordia, Moral Injury and the Cost of Survival, the first full account of the Ghost Battalion. The book was a quiet sensation among historians, but it was a 2005 documentary, Silent Battalion, that brought the story to a wider audience. Using Dr. Marsh's recordings, archival photos, and interviews with the few surviving relatives, it painted a portrait of trauma that resonated far beyond WW2. Veterans of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wrote to Chen saying, "This is us," because the Ghost Battalion was not unique to Stalingrad. They were the first documented case of what we now understand as moral injury, a wound to the soul caused not by fear, but by the violation of one's moral code, whether through action, inaction, or survival. And in that, their story is not history. It is prophecy. Today, Camp Concordia is gone. The barracks were torn down in 1946. The land was sold back to farmers. A grain silo now stands where Compound C once held the Ghost Battalion. There is no marker, no plaque, no memorial. But in 2012, a group of Kansas historians erected a small stone bench near the site, inscribed with a single line from the Book of Names. "We are still here. Forgive me."
Every year on January 12th, the anniversary of the final Soviet assault on Stalingrad, a handful of people gather there at dawn. Some are descendants of the prisoners. Some are veterans. Some are just locals who heard the story and felt its weight. They do not sing. They do not speak. They simply sit in silence. And for a few hours, the prairie remembers. But the true legacy of the Ghost Battalion lives not in Kansas, but in the way we understand trauma. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs officially recognized moral injury as a distinct condition from PTSD. Different, not in symptoms, but in source. PTSD comes from fear. Moral injury comes from guilt. And while fear can be treated, guilt must be reconciled. Programs now exist at VA hospitals across the country where veterans gather to share their stories, not of combat, but of conscience. They write letters to the dead. They light candles for the fallen. They speak the names no one else remembers. And in those rooms you can hear echoes of Camp Concordia. Because the need to honor the dead, to carry their names, to live in a way that makes their sacrifice meaningful is not weakness. It is the deepest form of love. The men of the Ghost Battalion did not fail because they broke. They broke because they cared too much. And in a world that often confuses strength with silence, their story is a reminder that the bravest thing a man can do is not to endure, but to remember. There is one final entry in the Book of Names, added not by a prisoner, but by Dr. Marsh herself, in 1988, a year before her death. It reads, "I once believed my role was to heal them, but they healed me. They showed me that humanity is not measured in victories, but in the willingness to carry the weight of loss without turning away. If you are reading this, know this. You are not alone in your guilt. You are not weak for your grief, and you are not forgotten. Because as long as one person remembers their name, they are still here, and so are you. That is the truth behind the Ghost Battalion. Not that they were haunted, but that they refused to let the dead be forgotten. And in that refusal, they became something more than prisoners, more than soldiers. They became keepers of memory. And in a world that moves too fast to mourn, that is the most sacred duty of all.